He never found it. No Santa Maria on the shores of the Caribbean, no confused Spaniards planting flags in places they didn't understand, and no New World accidentally discovered while looking for spices. That's right, Christopher Columbus never reached America, which means history, as we know it, just called in sick. Welcome to What If Horizons, where the past gets lost at sea, and the future scrambles to rewrite itself with the wrong map. Let's begin with the obvious. The man missed. Maybe it was a storm. Maybe he ran out of wine. Maybe the sailors finally mutinied when they realized India looked suspiciously un-Indian. Whatever the reason, Columbus turned back, or perished, or, let's get imaginative, was eaten by a particularly grumpy Atlantic kraken that believed strongly in indigenous land rights. Either way, no Spanish ships kiss American soil in 1492. No misnamed Indians. No Nina. No Pinta. No colonizer holiday. Now, you may be tempted to think, so what? Someone else would have done it. And you're not wrong, but you're not quite right either. Because history is not a neat queue of explorers waiting their turn. History is chaos. History is timing, ego, accidents, and occasionally, syphilis. Without Columbus kicking the door open, rudely, loudly, and with an alarming lack of cultural sensitivity, the entire European-American relationship unfolds differently. For starters, the Spanish crown, having poured gold into an expedition that delivered nothing but damp maps and broken morale, becomes skittish about transatlantic voyages. Queen Isabella turns her attention to less oceanic ventures, like crusading or breeding increasingly tiny lapdogs. Portugal, smelling opportunity, doubles down on its African and Indian Ocean trade networks. But nobody's rushing west across the Atlantic. The map still says, "Here be dragons," and after the Columbus embarrassment, most European nobles are content to leave those dragons alone. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, blissful ignorance. The civilizations of the Americas remain unbothered, unconquered, and, most crucially, uninfected. Smallpox does not come screaming ashore in waves of invisible terror. The Aztec Empire, instead of being toppled by a handful of steel-clad Spaniards and an unfortunate prophecy, continues to expand. The Inca Empire, unmolested by Pizarro's greedy fever dream, builds higher roads, deeper cities, and, who knows, maybe even invents the potato battery before Europe figures out how to wash regularly. But let's not get too utopian. Pre-Columbian America was no Edenic paradise. These were sophisticated, complex societies with their own hierarchies, wars, and moral gray zones. The difference is, they get time. Time to evolve. Time to industrialize, perhaps. Time to decide for themselves whether they wanted boats full of shouting men with facial hair and religious guilt. Now, Europe isn't going to stay out forever. Curiosity, greed, and the ever-pressing need to one-up the French will eventually push someone across the Atlantic. But it's not Columbus. It's not 1492. Maybe it's the English in the late 1500s, arriving with less gold fever and more awkward Protestantism. Or maybe it's the Chinese. Yes, the Chinese. If Zheng He's successors had decided not to mothball their massive treasure fleets. Imagine a Ming Dynasty outpost in modern-day Mexico. Now there's a historical butterfly effect worth contemplating. But back to our alternate timeline. With no Columbus planting a flag and claiming land like a child calling shotgun, the early scramble for the Americas doesn't happen. The Caribbean remains a mosaic of thriving island civilizations. The Taino people aren't decimated in a generation. They continue their seafaring traditions, maybe even expand. And most importantly, there is no immediate transatlantic slave trade. Without American colonies needing sugar plantations and tobacco profits, there's no economic incentive to industrialize human suffering on that scale. Slavery, of course, already exists. Every society's favorite hypocrisy, but the brutal machinery of chattel slavery across continents? That's delayed, diminished, perhaps never scaled to the horror we know. Europe, for its part, finds other ways to be awful. Wars continue. Inquisitions burn. France still invents bureaucracy, but its hunger for overseas empires takes a slower, different route. The idea of America, the continent, the identity, the dream, the future melting pot, develops not through conquest, but through contact, perhaps through trade, perhaps through diplomacy, or, brace yourself, mutual respect. Yes, Even history can try something new. As for Columbus himself, history shrugs. No statues, no protests to take them down. No American towns named after a man who got lost and thought the Bahamas were Southeast Asia. In this timeline, he becomes a footnote, a cautionary tale told in seafaring academies. Always check your compass, or you'll end up like Chris. And here's the most curious part. Without Columbus, the very idea of discovery shifts. Europe is forced to admit that these lands weren't discovered, they existed. They had names, histories, gods, plumbing. So instead of a story about bold adventurers taming a wild continent, maybe the dominant narrative becomes one of coexistence, negotiation, perhaps even alliance. Imagine schoolchildren in 2025 learning about the Great Treaty of 1548 between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Dutch Republic, or the invention of the two-deck canoe, co-developed by the Maya and a visiting group of confused Portuguese cartographers. Maybe we get jazz 300 years earlier. Maybe American languages are studied in Oxford. Maybe the word civilization finally stops being used as a weapon, all because one man didn't make it. That's the butterfly wing we're flapping today. The Great Mist Landfall of 1492. No Columbian Exchange. No genocide. No Thanksgiving mythology. Just a vast continent, still full of people, still telling stories, waiting to see who knocks on the door, and how they behave when they do. Of course, Europe would not remain a polite wallflower for long. Curiosity, profit, and a deep-seated desire to steal things that weren't nailed down ensured that someone would eventually get the bright idea to sail west. But without Columbus's dramatic stunt in 1492, the urgency is gone. The West isn't a gold mine waiting to be plundered. It's still a rumor wrapped in sea monsters and surrounded by fog. In the years following Columbus's failed voyage or convenient disappearance, the Spanish crown grows skeptical of future Atlantic adventures. After all, Isabella and Ferdinand have already sunk a fortune into one man's wild spice chase and ended up with sea lice and nothing to show for it. They retreat back into what monarchs do best, bickering over inheritance, tightening religious orthodoxy, and micromanaging their increasingly inbred aristocracy. Spain's imperial ambitions tilt east, where the Ottomans are more accessible and the Pope doesn't get seasick. Meanwhile, Portugal continues doing what Portugal does, colonizing the coastline of Africa, building a robust spice trade around the Cape of Good Hope, and investing in ships that don't explode on contact with the ocean. In this timeline, Vasco da Gama becomes the poster boy of European exploration. Maps are redrawn with Portuguese ports stretching like beads on a rosary from Lisbon to Calicut. If any European power is going to bump into the Americas, it'll likely be Portugal, accidentally, reluctantly, while trying to find a shortcut to a pepper warehouse. But the Atlantic? It's still a mystery. Sailors whisper about phantom islands, floating temples, and ghost ships. The idea of another continent is less inevitable and more romantic nonsense sailors dream up after too much rum and not enough scurvy prevention. And so, for a while, the Americas remain untouched by Europe's most obnoxious house guests. On the western side of the Atlantic, however, history continues, undisturbed, uncollapsed, gloriously complex. The Aztecs and Incas, still utterly unaware that they are being spared future documentaries with dramatic music and British narrators, keep doing what they do best: building, conquering, sacrificing, and occasionally inventing things like chinampas or elaborate feathered hats that put Versailles to shame. With no immediate foreign threat, the internal politics of the Americas evolve organically. Rivalries between empires escalate, but now they're more technological than existential. Imagine if the Inca, with their engineering prowess, focused on metallurgy and early forms of chemistry. Or if the Maya revived their astronomical traditions, using them to build predictive models that make European astrology look like a horoscope printed on a cereal box. Now throw in trade. Inter-American trade routes intensify. Goods, technologies, and ideas move between the North and the South in ways that real history interrupted. Picture a continent where Mississippian mound builders swap riverboat technology with Mayan architects. Or imagine a future where native peoples have unified currency systems before Europe figures out how to do banking without divine permission. And this is where it gets spicy, because sooner or later, some European vessel will make landfall. Maybe it's a battered French galley fleeing a naval battle. Maybe it's an English fishing boat blown wildly off course. But when it happens, let's say in 1540 instead of 1492, it's not a world of isolated tribes waiting for salvation. It's a continent of federations, merchant republics, and city-states that negotiate in multiple languages, have standing armies, and no patience for entitled men with shiny crosses and bad hygiene. The first European encounter in this timeline looks less like conquest and more like awkward diplomacy. Picture it, a sunburned English captain, starving, lost, and quoting the wrong Bible verses, stumbles into a Totonac trade port. He's greeted not with awe, but with paperwork. The local officials ask him to declare his purpose, submit any weapons for inspection, and refrain from spitting on the sacred plants. Confused but desperate, he complies. Within a week, he's offered a small trading lease, a translator, and a polite warning that further aggression will be met with unpleasant consequences involving obsidian blades and ritualized sarcasm. Back in Europe, this account causes confusion. The myth of savages waiting to be civilized crumbles. These Indians, still misnamed, of course, because no one ever lets go of a bad label, are organized, literate, and occasionally better dressed. The churches grow nervous. The merchants grow excited. And the monarchs? They begin planning trade delegations instead of invasions. And so, an alternate reality unfolds. The Americas become less a playground for colonizers and more a geopolitical partner, one whose balance of power must be respected. Treaties are written. Embassies are established. Translation becomes a hot career path. Instead of conquistadors, we get merchant ambassadors. Instead of missionary schools, we get exchange programs. One can almost imagine a class of Jesuit scholars in Tlaxcala nervously attempting Nahuatl grammar while local kids laugh at their accents. Of course, things still get complicated. Cultures clash. Epidemics may still spread eventually, though more slowly, giving societies time to adapt. But the essential difference is consent. The Americas are not taken, they are met. Meanwhile, in Europe, the myth of manifest destiny never takes root. The religious and racial justifications for conquest find less fertile soil when the others they encounter have calendars more accurate than the ones in Rome. Racism still exists. Let's not be naive. But it's harder to maintain superiority complexes when your ships keep breaking down while your inferior hosts offer engineering advice. In this new world, universities emerge not from colonial capitals, but from collaboration. Scholars from both hemispheres co-author texts on natural science, language, and art. Native governance systems influence European political reform. European navigation tools are adopted and improved upon in return. And somewhere, in a dusty lecture hall in Amsterdam, a historian poses a question that, in our reality, would be absurd. What if Columbus had reached America? The students laugh. A few shudder. And one quietly thanks whatever quirk of fate or storm or sea monster kept that man from ever stepping ashore. Because sometimes history's greatest gift is a failure. Now let's pause for a moment and appreciate the glorious absurdity of how things could unfold when colonization never became Europe's favorite sport. Without Columbus as the opening act, the New World remains, for a precious while, the unspoiled world. Not uninhabited, not undeveloped. Just undisturbed by pale men with questionable hygiene and a compulsive need to plant flags in places that already had names. So by the time someone else eventually makes landfall, say, a Dutch trader in a mood of existential curiosity, or a desperate Florentine entrepreneur looking to get rich on anything that doesn't involve banking, what they encounter isn't a blank slate for imperial ambitions. It's a continent already brimming with roads, rules, and revenge stories that go back centuries. They step off the boat not as lords of a new world, but as confused house guests crashing a party that started without them. And now, instead of marching across continents with fire and disease, Europeans are forced to play nice. Or at least pretend to, which leads to a much different flavor of cross-cultural exchange. Less God, gold, and glory, and more goods, gossip, and grudging respect. Imagine a French ambassador, powdered wig and all, negotiating trade rights with a council of Haudenosaunee elders who speak 3 more languages than he does and have absolutely zero patience for colonial theatrics. But this isn't just about diplomacy and awkward dinners. Let's talk about technology, because here's where it gets juicy. In our timeline, technological transfer was mostly one-directional: guns, germs, and steel heading west. But in this version, it's a two-way highway of ideas. The Americas have agriculture that Europe desperately needs: maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao, which, let's be honest, should have been treated as divine revelation. And instead of being stolen, these crops are traded, shared, or at worst, bartered in complex treaties involving marriage alliances, migration privileges, and, very likely, complicated local gossip. Meanwhile, native engineers and thinkers get access to European metallurgy, ship designs, and, eventually, printing presses. But not from conquerors, from colleagues. So the evolution of tech isn't a tale of pillaging, it's a ping-pong match between cultures pushing each other forward. Picture a bustling 17th-century Tenochtitlan, still standing tall, now with hybrid architecture, Aztec pyramids topped with Baroque astronomical observatories. Or an Inca city where steam-powered lifts move goods up the Andes, built with a mix of Spanish mechanics and indigenous stonework precision. You know, the kind of civilization that might actually survive a mild earthquake without crumbling like wet toast. Even religion, always the most awkward guest at the dinner party of human history, takes a different turn. Missionaries arrive, of course. They always do. But instead of bulldozing belief systems and baptizing entire villages at sword point, they're invited into philosophical debates that leave them sweating through their wool cassocks. Theologians argue not whether God exists, but whether he's been misquoted in Europe for the last 1,000 years. Jesuits return to Rome with notes, questions, and a lot of unresolved spiritual crises. The ripple effects of this version of history extend far beyond the Atlantic. Without the easy gold stolen from the Americas, Spain never ascends to its absurd golden age of empire. No silver flood to inflate the economy. No wealth to waste on endless wars. And, dare we say it, maybe fewer Baroque cathedrals built on guilt and bad accounting. Europe, deprived of its shortcut to global power, has to compete fairly for influence. So it invests more in science, diplomacy, and actual infrastructure instead of feeding its national pride on looted treasure and enslaved labor. Wars still happen. This is Europe, after all, but they are fought with slightly less God complex and slightly more actual strategy. As for Africa, here's where the real historical disruption gets interesting. With no immediate plantation economy across the Atlantic, the demand for enslaved Africans doesn't balloon into the monstrous trade that it became. Slavery, again, still exists. Humans are unfortunately inventive that way, but the scale and industrial brutality of the Atlantic slave trade never materialize. Africa gets a chance to develop on its own terms. Societies still struggle, succeed, expand, and clash, but not while bleeding millions into floating coffins. And the Caribbean? Still tropical, still storm-prone, but now a patchwork of independent islands, trading hubs, and maritime cultures where native, African, and European influences mix through actual interaction, not enslavement. Rum is still invented, because humans are always going to find a way to drink something fermented, but it's served at peace conferences, not slave auctions. Even the idea of the American dream morphs. In our timeline, it was built on stolen land, immigrant hustle, and a whole lot of rewriting the past. But in this alternate history, the Americas become a stage for cooperation, complexity, and truly bizarre fusion cultures. Imagine an indigenous Scandinavian jazz fusion movement, or a cuisine that combines French sauces with maize tortillas and fermented cactus blossom wine. Think less Thanksgiving myth, more annual Intercontinental Council on Collaborative Harvesting Practices, followed by a potluck so good it ends in a week-long festival of storytelling and diplomatic karaoke. What we're looking at here is not utopia. It's still messy, flawed, human, but it's a civilization not defined by conquest. A world shaped by accident, interaction, and occasional brilliance. A timeline where discovery didn't mean destruction, and where Columbus's absence, far from halting history, might just have saved it from itself. Because when one man failed to arrive, the world got a second chance, and it didn't blow it. At least, not yet. So by now, the picture's clear. No Columbus, No boots trampling ashore in the Bahamas, shouting, "India," with all the confidence of a man who's never looked at a globe. But as history rearranges itself around this void, we have to ask, how does the identity of the West emerge without this foundational myth of discovery? Because let's face it, the so-called discovery of America was a branding event. It launched centuries of propaganda, reshaped world maps, and fed generations of schoolchildren fairy tales about brave explorers heroically bumping into continents. Without Columbus, Europe has to invent a new story. One without conquest, without planting crosses in people's backyards, and without assuming every unknown culture needs to be saved by men with muskets and moral superiority. So how does that shape the Western mind? Well, for starters, the Enlightenment looks a little different. Instead of philosophers pontificating about the noble savage from the comfort of Paris salons, having never met a single person west of Portugal, they now have to wrestle with actual diplomatic exchanges, written responses, and thinkers from Tenochtitlan who challenge Cartesian dualism with cosmology built around maze, not geometry. Voltaire's smug grin starts to twitch. Rousseau rewrites his manuscripts 3 times. The Age of Reason? More like the age of intellectual humility. And science, too, takes a detour. In real history, European botanists went nuts when they stumbled upon New World plants, tobacco, chili peppers, chocolate. But they mostly stole them, labeled them in Latin, and pretended they discovered them between lunch and syphilis treatments. In this timeline, however, these botanists have to negotiate. They have to sit down with native experts, agriculturalists who've been managing these crops for centuries, and actually learn something. No renaming, no monopolizing, just cooperation, occasionally interrupted by ego, of course. They are European academics, after all. What emerges is a new kind of knowledge, a global science born not from theft, but synthesis. Libraries across continents contain multilingual codices. University courses include Nahuatl astronomy next to Greek logic. And the first International Scientific Society includes members from Cusco, Kyoto, and Copenhagen. Meetings are long, translators are overworked, but somehow it works. Even economics begins to shift. Without gold gushing out of Aztec temples and Incan mines, Spain's economy doesn't get its steroid injection of stolen wealth. No sudden empire, no armadas built from bullion, and perhaps, just perhaps, no 30 years were funded by divine arrogance and colonial surplus. Europe's economy stays closer to home, more grounded, less empire-driven. Mercantilism evolves slowly. Banking remains boring. And the Dutch still become rich, because of course they do, but now by trading actual goods instead of pirated silver. On the American side, new industries flourish. Not plantations, but trade guilds. Not monoculture cash crops, but diverse agriculture, long-distance networks, and artisanal production. Canoe routes through the Mississippi Basin buzz with goods, obsidian, textiles, cured fish, feathers, and eventually, yes, telescopes and copper compasses engraved with mythic beasts for good luck. Cultures collide, yes, but they also compose symphonies together. Literally. Imagine a 17th century opera written collaboratively by Spanish musicians and Mayan poets, performed with instruments made from jaguar bone and violin wood. Half the audience is confused. The other half is weeping. A few throw fruit out of sheer overwhelmed admiration. And now let's look at language. In our reality, English and Spanish dominate the Americas because they were beaten into the continent with fire and steel. But in this alternate history, the linguistic landscape is far richer. Indigenous languages remain strong, even gain prestige. Bilingualism becomes standard in cross-continental politics. Children in Quito grow up speaking Quechua and Dutch. Merchants in Havana haggle in Arawakan and Portuguese. A playwright in Mexico City writes comedies in 3 tongues and earns both a royal commission and a standing ovation from a mixed audience that laughs in different places for the same joke. And what about art? Well, without European conquest demolishing temples and burning codices, we don't lose millennia of indigenous literature, sculpture, and urban planning. We still have the cities of the Americas, alive, adapted, and awe-inspiring. Tourists from London pay good coin to visit the floating markets of Tenochtitlan. Painters in Florence study Inca color theory. And perhaps the Sistine Chapel includes a mural inspired by Aztec cosmology. Michelangelo, humbled by obsidian masks, rethinks his entire style. Even religion adapts. With no mass conversions at sword point, the spread of Christianity in the Americas is gentler, slower, more syncretic. Saints take on local traits. Missionaries learn local stories. Churches feature both crucifixes and carvings of maize gods. And theological debates rage, not over original sin, but over whether God prefers tortillas or communion wafers. None of this is smooth. Cultural clashes still occur. Misunderstandings flare. Trade disputes escalate into skirmishes. But there's no systemic annihilation, no extinction by decree. Instead of genocide, we get grudging coexistence. Instead of historical erasure, we get footnotes, revisions, and rival versions of the same event depending on who tells it. This version of the world doesn't offer utopia, but it does offer dignity. It offers a past that didn't have to be rewritten by the victors. It offers the radical notion that meeting other people doesn't require conquering them first. And to think, all of it because one Genoese sailor got lost, got scared, or got eaten by a squid. However it happened, it was the best navigational failure in human history. Because when Columbus missed, humanity may have finally hit something worth finding. At this point in our alternate timeline, the world begins to settle into a new rhythm. A complex, multilingual, occasionally awkward waltz between hemispheres. Instead of one hemisphere steamrolling the other, we see the slow, erratic weaving together of civilizations. And that means global history, as a whole, starts to reshape its narrative threads. Let's begin with one of history's favorite performance venues, war. Now, don't get your hopes up. War hasn't disappeared. Humans still squabble, hoard, posture, and occasionally throw sharp objects at each other. But without the easy money from plundered empires, European powers have fewer resources to fund the Baroque symphonies of bloodshed they were so fond of. That Spanish Armada? Smaller. The Napoleonic Wars? Still a thing, but with half the budget and twice the logistical nightmares. Colonies, once seen as piggy banks with coastlines, now require real diplomacy to maintain. Instead of conquistadors with divine entitlement, Europe sends cartographers, traders, and yes, the occasional poet who is terrible at math but great at writing odes to unknown plants. Nations must now trade cultural capital as well as goods. Reputation matters. Agreements are remembered. Embassies are respected, or at least tolerated with exaggerated size. And the Americas? They're not waiting politely for invitations to the party. In this version of the 17th and 18th centuries, native empires develop into continental players. The Inca, no longer crumbling under steel and disease, expand northward into sophisticated alliances. The Aztecs, whose internal politics would make Machiavelli blush, streamline their bureaucracy, and engage in trade missions to Europe by the time Bach is composing in Leipzig. They return with European instruments and awkward waltzing techniques that become all the rage in Tlaxcala ballrooms. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, already advanced in governance, begins exporting political theory. A French political philosopher, inspired by their federal model, publishes a radical pamphlet titled The League of Equals and finds himself banned in half the continent and idolized in the other half. Voltaire, curious, writes a snarky letter praising the idea but suggesting better wigs for the diplomats. But nothing, absolutely nothing, rattles the old world like the exchange of philosophies. Because here's the thing Europe never saw coming. The ideas flooding back across the Atlantic aren't just goods or stories. They're critiques, challenges, alternative ways of understanding the human condition. Concepts of justice not built on Roman law, but on consensus councils and restorative rituals. Concepts of time not linear, but cyclical. Concepts of community that prioritize balance over profit. And so begins the great intellectual panic of 1712. Priests panic. Monarchs frown. University professors update syllabi in a hurry. Debates rage in coffee houses over whether it's heresy or humility to admit Europe doesn't have a monopoly on wisdom. A Swiss theologian writes a deeply confused book trying to prove that Quetzalcoatl is actually a metaphor for Jesus. He sells 5 editions. Meanwhile, art enters a golden age of fusion. Imagine a Mesoamerican stained glass tradition, obsidian, and colored resin depicting cosmic myths, adopted by Gothic cathedrals. Imagine Andean metallurgy influencing Venetian sculpture. Imagine a performance in Paris featuring an orchestra of European violins, Peruvian pan flutes, and 3 uncomfortable Dutch men trying to keep up on hand drums. The applause is thunderous. No one knows what the play was about. Everyone agrees it was brilliant. In cities like Cusco, New Amsterdam, which never becomes New York, and Teotihuacan reborn, we see early global culture flourishing, not through domination, but experimentation. Scientists exchange methods. Artists critique each other's color palettes. Chefs steal ideas shamelessly and invent the world's first mole-based quiche. Even fashion evolves. In an alternate Versailles, nobles wear feathered cloaks gifted by Toltec envoys. A British queen commissions sandals inspired by Zapotec craftsmanship and becomes the subject of 17 political cartoons. French perfumers experiment with cacao-scented oils and claim spiritual enlightenment. Half of them start talking to birds. But perhaps the most significant difference lies in how people see each other. Without centuries of colonial myth-making, racial hierarchies don't ossify in the same brutal, industrial way. Prejudice still exists. It's humanity, not utopia, but it doesn't calcify into the pseudo-scientific madness that produced slavery justified by charts and skull measurements. Without Columbus's discovery, the narrative that Europe is the center and everyone else is an afterthought never fully solidifies. The Atlantic, rather than a moat around Fortress Europe, becomes a bridge between equals. Children grow up reading folk tales from both hemispheres. Schools teach dual histories. Language evolves into strange, beautiful hybrids. There are still borders, of course, but fewer walls. And instead of Old World and New World, people begin speaking of the twinning worlds. 2 vast traditions that met not with conquest, but curiosity. It is messy, it is loud, it is hilariously awkward, but it is alive. And all of it, the diplomacy, the philosophy, the footnotes in history textbooks that actually include citations from people who didn't wear powdered wigs, exists because one man, 5 centuries ago, either turned his ship around, got lost, or was eaten by something angry with a tentacle. No Columbus, no conquest. No conquest, no catastrophe. No catastrophe, no need to rebuild history from the ashes of what it destroyed. Instead, we build forward, together, with suspicious glances and sarcastic commentary, yes, but also with dialogue, respect, and the occasional tamale shared over peace talks. And history, for once, doesn't taste like blood. It tastes like possibility. By now, the world has rewritten itself into something almost unrecognizable to us. A place where history didn't fracture along the spine of a single man's ambition. A place where the so-called New World was never forcibly molded into a copy of the old. But to truly understand the long-term impact of this alternate path, we need to ask one more uncomfortable question. What happens to the global balance of power? In our timeline, Europe became the center of gravity for centuries. Fueled by wealth torn from the Americas, driven by empires built on the backs of the colonized, it stretched its influence across the world like a particularly entitled octopus in a powdered wig. But in this version, the power map is redrawn. Slowly, subtly, radically. Let's start with the Americas. The Inca Empire, no longer interrupted by Pizarro's bad manners and worse intentions, continues expanding both north and south. With a road network already more advanced than anything Spain had to offer, and bureaucratic systems capable of organizing resources across mountains and deserts, the Inca become a true continental force. Not a frozen remnant of what might have been, but a living engine of innovation. They develop early water turbines using mountain streams. They refine their Quipu record system into a form of proto-digital data storage. They invent a postal system so efficient it makes European messengers look like confused turtles. Their engineers are recruited by other nations. Their scholars are cited in Europe's journals. Their diplomats are treated like royalty because, well, they are. To the north, confederacies like the Haudenosaunee evolve into full-fledged federations, with legal codes admired by reformers in France and Scotland. Their councils inspire Enlightenment thinkers. Benjamin Franklin, still annoyingly quotable in this universe too, praises their model of governance in letters to colleagues. Only this time, instead of plagiarizing them for the U.S. Constitution, he invites their leaders to Philadelphia to help draft it. Yes, there's still a Philadelphia, but it's bilingual. and the cheesesteak comes with ceremonial maize sauce. Meanwhile, Mesoamerican civilizations, once thought doomed by real-world historians, become economic dynamos. Tenochtitlan modernizes its infrastructure, introducing clean water systems that shame Victorian London. The Maya, often mistaken as vanished in our timeline, build observatories that attract astronomers from Prague and Kyoto. Toltec engineers develop early steel alloys. Zapotec designers invent pyramid-shaped acoustics halls where sound echoes like a whisper from the gods. And all this intellectual and technological growth isn't locked behind borders. The Atlantic becomes a conduit of exchange, not extraction. So what about Europe? Well, without the gushing silver mines of Potosi or the free labor of enslaved peoples in Caribbean sugar fields, European powers are humbled. Spain does not become a bloated empire with a terrible credit rating. Portugal focuses more on Indian Ocean trade and less on Atlantic expansion. France still finds time for revolutions. Some things are inevitable, but they erupt out of real inequality, not colonial overreach. The British Empire? Still ambitious, still tea-obsessed, but significantly more focused on navigating diplomacy than enforcing dominion. India remains a wealthy, sovereign patchwork of kingdoms and confederacies. African nations develop regionally without the traumatic hemorrhage of millions into the slave trade. The continent's internal trade routes become highways of growth, not arteries of exploitation. This doesn't mean peace reigns eternal. Humans remain human. Borders still spark tension. Resources still incite greed. But without the asymmetric shock of European colonization crashing down like a divine hammer, the world evolves with more balance, more give and take, and, dare we say it, more creativity. And this leads us to perhaps the most fascinating shift of all, how humanity views itself. In our real timeline, colonial conquest created a global hierarchy. It invented race as a tool of control. It justified horrors with pseudoscience and theology wrapped in nationalism. But in this alternate version, where first contact was guided by trade instead of trauma, those artificial hierarchies never calcify into doctrine. Prejudice still exists. There are still power imbalances, suspicions, misunderstandings. But there's no systemic global ideology convincing people that one's skin color or language or God-given manifest destiny makes them inherently superior. The idea of civilization isn't owned by one hemisphere. It's a collective project, and that changes everything from education to ethics, from literature to law. Children grow up learning from both sides of the ocean, not as colonizers and colonized, but as co-authors of a shared history. They memorize poems from Cusco and Canterbury. They study philosophy from Aristotle and Ashayakadal. They argue over whether the best pyramids were built in Giza or Teotihuacan. Spoiler, they agree both are cool, and the debate is mostly an excuse to avoid algebra. Religious syncretism flourishes, not out of forced conversions, but through curiosity and collaboration. Temples feature stained glass shaped like jaguars. Cathedrals adopt maize motifs in their carvings. Spirituality is seen not as a zero-sum game, but as a mosaic with room for many truths. And here's the kicker: even nature benefits. Without the plantation economy devouring entire ecosystems for profit, biodiversity holds on longer. Forests in Brazil remain thick. Bison still roam in thunderous herds. Rivers run clearer. Species long extinct in our world, from passenger pigeons to Caribbean monk seals, thrive. Indigenous environmental knowledge is not dismissed but institutionalized. The concept of sustainability isn't a 21st century buzzword, it's a foundational principle of development. So yes, there are still wars, still diseases, still revolutions and bad poetry and people who talk too loudly in libraries. But there's also a global network of respect. There's rivalry, but not supremacy. There's ambition, but not annihilation. There's history, but not a monopoly on how it must be remembered. And all of it, every detail, every divergence, every dazzling detour from the world we know, began because a man with a ship full of bad maps never made it across the ocean. Christopher Columbus never reached America. And in doing so, perhaps he helped the world reach something far more precious. Its own better version. Now we wade into the strange waters of unintended consequences, the ripples that no map can chart. We've sketched a world where Columbus never blundered into the Bahamas and declared, with all the misinformed confidence of a man who didn't invent the compass but sure acted like he did, that he'd reached Asia. And in doing so, we've reshaped history. But how does culture evolve in a world that isn't carved up, labeled, and redrawn by empire? Let's start with storytelling. In our timeline, Western literature absorbed, and often distorted, the stories of the Americas. Myths were exoticized, repackaged, and sanitized into romantic tales fit for opera stages and bored noble women sipping chocolate stolen from plantations. But in this world, the stories of the Americas are never secondhand. They're central. They're told by their original voices, in their own languages, their own cadence, their own stubborn refusal to be boiled down to noble savage or tragic victim. The epic of Popol Vuh becomes as studied in Rome as the Iliad. Inca creation myths are debated in London salons. A Mayan playwright is translated into French, then banned in Paris for being too politically relevant. Indigenous theater, blending ritual, satire, and ceremony, influences Shakespeare, who, in this timeline, writes a lesser-known but deeply weird play about a Tlaxcalan prince and a ghost made of hummingbirds. But culture doesn't just move on scrolls and scripts. It moves through music, food, and fashion. So let's talk about those. Musically, the fusion is glorious chaos. Europe's rigid scales meet the microtonal systems of the Andes. The result? A Baroque folk hybrid that baffles purists and inspires revolutionaries. A traveling troupe called the Symphonic Quipus tours the world with instruments made of bronze, bone, and brass. Their debut album includes a sonata written entirely in Quipu knots, which critics call visually brilliant but completely unplayable. It sells out anyway. Meanwhile, cuisine explodes. Without conquest, culinary exchange becomes a love affair, not a looting. Chocolate isn't dumped into sugar-laden colonial molds. It evolves in its homeland and is served alongside fermented vanilla root liquor at elite Parisian banquets. The potato is still exported, but this time with instructions, history, and a proper ceremony. In Venice, indigenous chefs open authentic fusion restaurants that become wildly trendy. Everyone pretends to understand the symbolism of the three-colored maize dumplings. No one does. But the flavors are exquisite, and the servers are gracious, if slightly amused. And then there's fashion. Feathers are no longer a costume, but couture. A Zapotec designer collaborates with Flemish weavers to create a textile movement that dominates fashion weeks from Amsterdam to Tenochtitlan. A single ceremonial cape, embroidered with both Spanish royal crests and Nawa glyphs, sparks an international bidding war and is eventually worn by a Swedish queen during her intercontinental wedding to an Aymara astronomer. Yes, intercontinental marriages are a thing now. Get used to it. With culture flowing freely, identity no longer depends on conquest, but connection. A child in Quito might wear boots made in Bruges, read poems from Senegal, and offer morning prayers to a feathered deity and a Catholic saint. Because in this world, religious exclusivity is as outdated as powdered wigs and maps that call everything terra incognita. Now, you might be thinking, surely, not everything's harmonious. Surely, someone somewhere decides to screw it all up. Of course they do. Enter the new geopolitics. In this world, power isn't measured by square miles of colonies, but by networks of influence, education, and trade. It's a world of soft power wars, diplomatic duels fought with treaties, not troops. It's less imperialism and more influentialism. Instead of World War I as we know it, we get something else entirely. A cold treaty period where major civilizations, Europe, the Pan-Andean Confederation, the Mesoamerican Trade Bloc, the West African Maritime League, compete in diplomatic brinkmanship. Spies infiltrate libraries instead of bunkers. Propaganda is printed on rice paper and posted to philosophical journals. There's a scandal involving forged codices and a bribery ring that nearly topples the Lisbon Assembly. Technology becomes the new arena of escalation. Not weapons, but breakthroughs in medicine, transport, and yes, even airships. With fewer empires to exploit labor, innovation has to come from actual science. Imagine a 19th century where hybrid solar steam galleons glide between continents, crewed by multilingual scientists arguing about crop rotation and jazz chords. In this world, the space race doesn't begin with rockets built by Nazi scientists. It starts with a joint Muisca-Chinese observatory in the Andes that detects anomalies in Venus's orbit. 10 years later, the first intercontinental space program is formed. Its name? The Eagle Jaguar Initiative. Its motto? We all looked up at the same sky. We're not done. Education, once a privilege reserved for European aristocrats and monks, becomes decentralized and globalized. Universities sprout in Cusco, Lagos, Kyoto, Tikal. Instead of ranking knowledge hierarchically, they build what they call knowledge circles, networks of scholarship that value indigenous wisdom as highly as Western theory. A student might major in comparative astronomy, Mayan, Arabic, and Newtonian traditions. It's weird. It's wonderful. It's human. And through all this, the question echoes, what happens to the myths we've built around ourselves? Because without Columbus, without manifest destiny, without centuries of colonizers painting themselves as civilizers, we lose the neat moral narratives. The world isn't divided into discoverers and discovered, civilized and savage. It's messy, nuanced, entangled. Everyone's a teacher. Everyone's a student. Everyone's trying not to spill maize wine on the translation dictionary. And that, somehow, makes it all feel more real, more earned, more alive. We didn't rewrite history in this world. We rewrote the idea that one man could define it. So now we're in a world that didn't split history into before Columbus and after conquest. The Western Hemisphere wasn't hijacked, pillaged, and shoehorned into someone else's narrative. Instead, it charted its own course and shared the steering wheel with the rest of humanity. But here's where things get truly strange. Not because of flying pyramids or transatlantic jazz bands, although yes, those exist too, but because of the most fragile, volatile, and unpredictable element of any civilization, human nature. Let's talk about psychology. In our timeline, colonialism didn't just shape borders. It carved scars into collective identity. Entire generations were taught they were lesser, primitive, lucky to be civilized. Languages were erased, gods mocked, ancestors labeled heathens. That trauma didn't vanish with independence, it mutated. It seeped into how people saw themselves. It rewrote confidence, culture, ambition. But in this version, that psychological baggage never piles up. There's no global inferiority complex born from being conquered, no whitewashed beauty standards imported through gunpowder and Jesuit sermons. Children grow up seeing faces like theirs in art, in science, in leadership, not as tokens or firsts, but as the default. Imagine the confidence of an Aymara girl in La Paz knowing her grandmother's textile patterns inspired the architecture of a cathedral in Florence. Imagine a Zapotec boy learning both calculus and the spiritual geometry of his people, taught not in opposition, but as complementary truths. Imagine how differently the global conversation sounds when self-worth isn't calibrated by colonial approval. That matters. It shapes politics. It shapes art. It shapes love. And yet, because the universe insists on balance, this alternate history isn't all sunshine and pan flutes. There are new tensions, new fault lines. When no single civilization dominates, everyone has to negotiate. Constantly. Uncomfortably. It's slower, messier, and makes for truly agonizing diplomatic banquets. But it also prevents the arrogance of supremacy. Without a Europe inflated by conquest, there's less entitlement to impose. There are fewer grand plans to remake entire continents in our image. Fewer theological justifications for slavery. Fewer exhibitions where human beings are displayed in cages next to exotic birds. History still has villains, but they don't have empires to hide behind. And here's something delightfully ironic. In this world, Europe becomes interesting. Freed from the bloated self-importance of empire, European societies explore ideas without assuming their universal superiority. They look inward. They experiment. They argue not about whether France should rule Africa, but whether the Louvre should house artifacts from Mali or send them back with interest. Spoiler, they do both, and then debate it for another 50 years, because they're French. Meanwhile, the Americas thrive, not as Western carbon copies, but as their own thing. Imagine cities where urban planning blends sacred geometry with renewable energy. Markets where barter and crypto coexist. Hospitals that offer both neurosurgery and ritual healing, not because of superstition, but because science finally acknowledged that the mind and soul aren't enemies. Let's zoom in for a moment. In this world, a Nala poet wins the Global Peace Prize for a bilingual collection of verses titled, "We Were Never Discovered." The book, subtitled "Because We Were Never Lost," becomes a bestseller in 30 countries and sparks a global movement. Decolonize the mind. Protesters march in Madrid, Cusco, and Nairobi, demanding school curriculums that include indigenous histories not as footnotes, but as foundational. Meanwhile, universities in Tenochtitlan host annual philosophy Olympics. This year's theme? Ethics without empire. The competition includes debates, riddles, ritual dances, and an interpretive sculpture duel that confuses everyone except the judges. The winners are two students, one from Vietnam, one from the Andean highlands, who co-write a manifesto that reads like Plato went on a shamanic retreat and came back with a tattoo of the Milky Way. Is it utopia? No. It's better. It's believable. There's conflict, but not extermination. There's disagreement, but not dehumanization. There's power, but it's decentralized, negotiated, shared. And through it all, the world feels more honest. Not everyone loves it, of course. There are still demagogues, still trolls, still cable news networks that insist Aztec astronomy is part of a global liberal agenda to eliminate daylight savings time. But those voices don't dominate. They sputter. They get fact-checked. They end up hosting low-budget podcasts with names like True Civilization and Censored. And because no civilization got to declare itself the sole narrator of history, everyone has to listen more, talk less, learn faster. So what happens next? Space. Yes, really. Because without centuries wasted on colonization and its cascading traumas, humanity reached the stars sooner. Collaboration wasn't a last resort. It was baked into the system. The first lunar base? A joint project between the Toltec Astrophysics Council and the European Consortium for Cosmic Harmony. The first Martian rover? Designed by a team of teenage engineers from Ghana, Korea, and the Lakota Nation. They name it Tlazikamati, a Nahuatl word meaning I thank you. Because in this world, gratitude isn't weakness. It's the engine of civilization. Which brings us to the most absurd, beautiful truth of all. Columbus never found America. And in doing so, humanity found itself. Not all at once. Not perfectly, but fully. Without erasure. Without apology. With songs that carried across oceans and philosophies that couldn't be mapped. A history not stolen, but shared. And now we arrive at the edge of the modern era. A world that evolved without the old world forcibly planting its flags into the new. A world where the Americas, untouched by European conquest, became full participants in global history, not as lands discovered, but as lands that helped define what discovery truly meant. So here we stand, metaphorically of course, staring down the 21st century. What does this future look like when it isn't built on the bones of genocide and the rubble of empires? Let's start with cities. Megacities exist, of course. You can't stop humans from clustering together and building absurdly tall things. But the design philosophy is different. Instead of sprawling concrete jungles that suffocate rivers and bulldoze history, urban planning here balances expansion with continuity. A skyscraper in modern-day Cusco includes terraces for quinoa farming, solar panels that mimic the shape of condor wings, and a museum on its roof dedicated to the gods of thunder and Wi-Fi. Public spaces are sacred, not in the incense and chanting sense, though there's plenty of that, too, but in the way they foster conversation. Plazas aren't parking lots with bad landscaping. They're active forums, where elders recite stories, kids learn drumming, and someone always seems to be handing out fermented cactus juice while ranting about cosmic responsibility. In this world, the technological revolution still happens, but its tone is entirely different. Without centuries of extractive imperialism feeding capitalist overdrive, innovation isn't fueled by pillaging. It's driven by purpose. Gadgets aren't just designed to capture your data and sell you hair loss supplements. They're tools built to improve real lives, not just shareholder portfolios. The internet exists. It's global, fast, and yes, still full of cat videos. But its origin story is one of cooperative infrastructure, not military dominance. The first intercontinental data cable was laid by a coalition of island nations seeking educational access, not by intelligence agencies seeking backdoors. Encryption was invented by Polynesian navigators, and the most popular browser is called Kipunet. It ties information together in colorful, non-linear strands, and is both frustratingly beautiful and beautifully frustrating. Social media exists too, But instead of algorithms designed to enrage, it features what's called reciprocal uplift protocol. In short, if you post something inflammatory, the platform gently suggests 3 indigenous proverbs and a video of a sloth making ethical life choices. The toxicity isn't gone, but it's weirdly poetic now. And what about climate? Here's the real miracle. Without 5 centuries of industrial-scale extraction, mass monoculture, and colonial disregard for the land, the planet is okay. Not perfect. We still flirted with disaster. Fossil fuels were discovered. Carbon emissions rose. But the response was faster. Why? Because entire civilizations, Inca, Hopi, Yoruba, already treated the earth as animate, sacred, self-aware. That worldview wasn't erased. It was institutionalized. Earth wasn't property. It was a partner. The Paris Climate Agreement, signed a century earlier. The first carbon tax, invented by a Mapuche economist. The greenest city on Earth, Lagos, with vertical forests inspired by Aztec floating gardens and bus stops that also serve as herbal tea stations. Take that, Copenhagen. But let's not pretend it's all perfect harmony and eco-utopia. There are still struggles. Power still consolidates. Corruption still festers. There are governments that censor, corporations that exploit, and billionaires who own more alpacas than is morally reasonable. There are protests, strikes, bitter elections. There's a scandal involving genetically modified cacao and a populist leader nicknamed the Caramel Cotelo. But there is also resilience. There are indigenous political parties winning national elections. There are truth commissions, not just for war crimes, but for educational erasures. There are youth-led tribunals that rule against textbook publishers for calling colonization a friendly encounter. And perhaps the greatest revolution of all, history itself. Museums are no longer mausoleums of loot. They're centers of exchange. That golden mask from a tomb in Oaxaca? It rotates between continents, escorted by ceremonial guards and child poets. Each time it arrives in a new city, a festival is held, not in its honor, but in the honor of the people who made it. History is no longer a trophy case. It's a chorus. And in that chorus, one voice rings especially loud, not because it conquered, but because it wasn't erased. The voice of the Americas. Imagine the textbooks. Instead of Columbus sailed the ocean blue, they open with a Nawa creation myth, segue into a Quechua engineering schematic, detour through a Haudenosaunee treaty, and wrap with a Taino lullaby. Children learn that no one discovered America, because America was never lost. There are commemorations, yes, not of arrival, but of encounter. October 12th is now Reciprocity Day, celebrated with parades, debates, and lots of awkward hugging between rival historians. And that brings us to now, to a world, strange, familiar, alive, built not on conquest, but contact, where the meeting of civilizations wasn't a scream in the dark, but a long, tangled conversation that no one ever finished. And that's the point. No culture gets the final word. No one gets to close the book and declare, history ends here. Instead, the story continues. It mutates. It grows feathers. It learns to fly. And somewhere, a little kid in Quito logs into Kipunet, uploads her first painting, a surrealist jaguar flying a hot air balloon over Atlantis, and wonders, quietly, what would have happened if someone named Columbus had gotten to America after all. Then she shrugs and goes outside to play. So here we are, on the final page of a book that was never written. A history that danced just outside our own timeline, teasing the edges of possibility. A world where Christopher Columbus never set foot on the shores of the Caribbean, never claimed what he didn't understand, never planted flags where languages had already bloomed for millennia. And in his absence, something extraordinary happened. Not paradise, not utopia, but a world less broken. In this alternate reality, the Americas were never treated as blank slates for Europe's colonial fantasies. They were never renamed, rebranded, or repurposed. They were respected, negotiated with, engaged. And what did that change? Everything. When you remove the spark that ignited centuries of conquest, you don't just change who rules which land. You rewrite the story of human progress. The Enlightenment, in this world, isn't the smug glow of European self-congratulation. It's a global awakening. It emerges not from the salons of Paris alone, but from the maize fields of Mesoamerica, the stargazers of the Andes, the wisdom keepers of the Haudenosaunee. Science doesn't march westward, it flows in every direction. Ideas aren't stolen, they're shared. Mathematics isn't taught in towers, it's sung in marketplaces. Astronomy is still obsessed with Mars, but also with Venus, whose symbolic meaning in this world is as crucial as its physical properties. Religion? That complicated creature. Without the violent spread of European Christianity, faith evolves differently. The old gods aren't buried, they're invited to sit at the same table. Missionaries are replaced by pilgrims. Instead of holy wars, we get spiritual councils, where Buddhist monks, Yoruba priests, Catholic bishops, and Andean shamans argue over cosmology and then agree to trade herbal remedies and dance rituals. The concept of heresy still exists, but now it mostly applies to anyone who double dips at the ceremonial hummus table. And race? That toxic construct, the one our world uses to justify hierarchy, exclusion, exploitation, it never metastasizes here. Skin color never becomes destiny. Ethnicity is identity, yes, but not a chain. Cultures still clash. Prejudice still happens. But without slavery as the economic foundation of empire, racism remains a vice, not a system. Think about that for a moment. No transatlantic slave trade as we know it. No Middle Passage. No racialized laws to codify who is human and who is property. In this timeline, people are still cruel, but the world doesn't build entire economies around that cruelty. And that difference? It echoes through everything. Music evolves without minstrel shows. Policing evolves without slave patrols. Politics evolves without the need to suppress entire populations just to preserve false hierarchies. It's not perfect. There are still revolutions, still blood, still tyrants who rise by promising certainty in an uncertain world. But their reach is limited. Their myths don't hold. Because without a Columbus, there was no discovery narrative, no divine right to rule, no single story to justify 1,000 atrocities. Instead, there are many stories. Messy, contradictory, beautiful. And what does that do to us? Us, the imagined listeners, the time travelers looking in. It forces us to ask a more uncomfortable question. Not, what if Columbus hadn't reached America? But why did he have to? Why did we need the idea of discovery so badly? Why did we cling to the fiction that progress required plunder? Why do we still build statues to men who couldn't read the maps they claimed to master? The answer, perhaps, is fear. Fear of complexity. Fear of parody. Fear of a world where no one gets to declare themselves the hero of everyone else's story. But the alternate history we just explored, the one without Columbus, without conquest, without annihilation, it shows us that a different path was always possible. Still is. Because history isn't finished. Not really. Even now, we shape it. With our choices, our institutions, our willingness to listen or bulldoze. Every day, we decide whether we'll repeat the old story or write a new one. So what if Christopher Columbus never reached America? Maybe the better question is, what if we finally stop pretending that he had to? What if we stop waiting for discovery and start recognizing the worlds that were always already here? Thanks for exploring that journey with us. You've been listening to What If Horizons, where the past never stays put and the future is always up for revision. Until next time, stay curious, question the maps, and remember, the only thing more powerful than rewriting history is unlearning it.